You are 31 years old, and you have been living inside a lie for 14 months. Not the comfortable kind of lie that most undercover officers describe in debriefs, the kind with a clear edge where the fiction ends and you begin. The kind where you wake up at 3 in the morning and spend 40 seconds genuinely uncertain which name is yours. The department calls this identity saturation. Your therapist, when you still had access to one, call it dissociation. You call it Tuesday. The assignment started as a financial crimes investigation. A tech company called Luminary Systems had been flagged by 3 separate federal agencies for patterns consistent with large-scale wire fraud, unlicensed securities offerings, and what one analyst memo described as cult-adjacent behavioral control mechanisms in its employee and investor community. The company sold a productivity and wellness platform, an app, a subscription model, a series of retreats, and a philosophy built around a concept. Its founder called conscious acceleration. The founder was a man named Elliot Vance, 44, former Stanford neuroscience PhD candidate who had dropped out in his 3rd year and spent a decade in venture capital before pivoting to what he described in every interview as the most important human project of the 21st century. He had the face of a man who had never once doubted himself and the voice of someone who had practiced making that face and that voice in a mirror for a very long time. Your cover was clean. Backstopped identity, complete digital footprint, 3 years of fabricated professional history as a mid-level UX researcher in Seattle with 2 published articles in minor industry journals that the department had ghostwritten and placed. You made contact through a Luminary community event in San Francisco, a free evening seminar in a rented conference room with good lighting and terrible coffee and 40 people who all looked like they were waiting for someone to tell them something they already almost believed. Vance was not there. His lieutenants were. You introduced yourself, handed over a card that did not exist 2 months before, and smiled in the way that undercover training teaches you to smile with your whole face, but not your eyes, because sincerity reads differently than performed sincerity in the people in rooms like this one have been trained by someone who knows the difference. The first 3 months were low level. Community events, online forums, a weekend retreat in Marin that cost $1,200 and involved 16 hours of structured group exercises designed to identify what Vance's methodology called your limiting architecture. The limiting architecture was the sum of all the beliefs, relationships, and habits that were preventing you from operating at your full cognitive and emotional potential. The exercises were sophisticated, not in the crude way of older manipulation. Frameworks, not shouting matches or sleep deprivation or manufacture crisis. Subtle, graduated, a series of carefully engineered social environments in which the most comfortable and rewarded behavior was progressive disclosure of personal vulnerability combined with progressive adoption of luminary framing for every disclosed experience. By the end of the weekend, 40 people had told strangers things they had not told their closest friends and had been applauded for doing so, and had begun, without being instructed, to describe their preliminary lives using the company's vocabulary for dysfunction. You took notes in a journal the department had provided and kept them under a loose floorboard in your cover apartment and wrote clinical observations about group dynamics and financial solicitation patterns, and went to bed each night feeling like you had spent the day inside a machine that was very slowly taking you apart and reassembling you in a configuration that was easier to manage. The financial operation became visible in month 4. Luminary offered a tiered investment vehicle called the Acceleration Fund, framed not as an investment, but as a commitment to the community's shared mission, with projected returns described in materials that were carefully designed to imply financial gain without technically promising it. The minimum entry was $25,000. The fund had no registered prospectus, no SEC filing, no third-party audit. What it had was 312 committed community members who had spent between 6 months and 4 years in Luminary's social ecosystem, and who had been progressively isolated from external relationships and external frames of reference to a degree that made the 25,000 feel like proof of seriousness rather than risk. You documented everything: wire transfer instructions, pitch scripts, the names of the 7 senior members who conducted the solicitation conversations. You had enough for a federal case by month 5. You did not call in at month 5. The reason you told your handler was that the financial fraud, while documentable, was only the visible surface, and that the behavioral control architecture underneath it was the actual mechanism, and that dismantling the fund without understanding the full operational structure would produce a prosecution that missed the point. The reason you did not tell your handler was that by month 5 you had been living inside the community long enough that the border between observation and participation had become genuinely difficult to locate. You had a cover name, Marcus Webb, that people said to you with warmth and familiarity. You had relationships that were manufactured and felt real. You had sat in enough sessions with Vance himself, small group intensives for senior members, to understand that he was not simply a fraudster. He was a man who believed completely in what he was doing, which made him more dangerous than any cynical operator and more difficult to categorize in the moral taxonomy you had been using to navigate this work. Vance called it Cascade, the moment when a member's limiting architecture collapsed completely and their natural operating capacity became accessible without interference. He described it in clinical language borrowed from neuroscience and in spiritual language borrowed from 4 or 5 traditions simultaneously, and in the language of high-performance athletics and in the language of love, and the combination was precisely calibrated to reach every possible entry point in every possible listener. You watched it work on people who were not stupid: engineers, lawyers, a former State Department official, a woman who had run a hedge fund for 9 years. You watched intelligent adults hand over their retirement savings and their marriage decisions and their career choices to a framework constructed by one man in a rented conference room in San Francisco. Of the cover apartment, locate the exact mechanism that separated them from you. Month 11, you made a mistake. Not an operational mistake, nothing that compromised the case or your identity. A human one. A senior member named Clara, 38, former architect, 3 years inside the community, had begun the process of liquidating a property. Her parents had left her in order to increase her acceleration fund commitment. You knew her well enough by then. You had sat through 40 hours of group sessions with her, had heard her describe her marriage ending and her father dying, and the 2 years of depression that had preceded her finding Luminary with the particular gratitude of someone who has been genuinely helped by the thing that is also destroying them. You could not watch the property sale proceed without doing something that was not in the operational playbook. You told her, in a conversation you kept off every device and never reported, that she should talk to a financial advisor outside the community before making the transfer. You said it carefully, in language that did not break cover. She looked at you for a long moment and said that her limiting architecture was telling her to be afraid, and that she had learned not to listen to it. She completed the transfer 11 days later. You called it in at month 14. The case was strong enough to prosecute, and you were no longer certain you were the Right person being cited. Your handler pulled you out on a Thursday, and you sat in a federal building in a room with fluorescent lighting and gave a 7-hour debrief that was thorough and accurate, and during which you did not mention Clara, or the conversation that was not in the playbook, or the 40 seconds every morning when you were not sure which name was yours. The indictment came 4 months later. Vance was arrested at a retreat in Sedona. 11 charges, including wire fraud, securities fraud, and unlawful coercion. The acceleration fund investors were identified as victims. Clara was on the list. She gave a statement to prosecutors that described her involvement in the precise vocabulary of dysfunction that Luminary had given her, which was the vocabulary Luminary used for the preliminary self. And you read in a transcript and thought about how the language we use to describe the thing that hurt us is often the last piece of it we managed to put down. You were reassigned to a new case the following Monday. You had a different name ready. You were very good at this.